Welcome, students, teachers, and the constitutional nerds from all walks of life to our 141st episode and episode 1 of the 2025 winter-spring season of the Constitution in American Life with us, the Friends of Publius, or otherwise known as fracking old people. For the next 13 weeks or so, we will be focusing on topics like the right and righteousness of the anti-federalists, greed as a positive or negative incentive on constitutional government, and the rise of secessionist movements in the US of A. Our hope is to help students and teachers as they prepare for the We the People National Finals to be held in early mid-April in Washington, D.C. Before we begin our discussion on the concept of founding, as in founding fathers, a couple of items. First, we are taping this episode just a few days after the death of our 39th president, James Earl Carter. Jimmy Carter ran in what was the first presidential election that I participated in, and although I did not vote for Carter, I do credit him with providing a major motivation for my intellectual and career focus. I believe, and the other FOPs may disagree with me, that he delivered one of the most significant presidential speeches in my life in July of 1979, known as the Crisis in Confidence speech. I believe that he presented a rather prescient view of America at the time, and possibly even more so today. If you have not read the speech, students and teachers, I highly recommend it. Fox, any thoughts about President Carter and his life and that speech at all?
Well, it was known as the malaise speech, but he never used the word. And I thought it was interesting because he was very honest with the American people. I think that's the thing. I appreciated the honesty or the candor with which he spoke. I was reading one of the many obituaries about his life, and I think I shared with a friend that, good God, I wish every presidential obituary read like that in terms of a man of service and giving, who talked the talk and walked the walk, and a man of sacrifice. And the fact that when he was asked what was the bigger thrill, winning the Nobel Peace Prize or winning the presidency, he said it was when his wife of 77 years said yes to marrying him. What how far we've wandered from that. I think his presidency, there were some issues during the presidency, historians will have written about, but as a man, probably one of the most devout and sincere people to ever occupy the office.
I think, David, you've raised this. I mean, we've known each other now 3 decades, but I remember this came up decades ago. You mentioned this speech, and you made that statement that you thought his crisis of confidence speech was one of the best of the 20th century. And I remember at first blush, I thought, well, you're nuts. But I went and reread it, and I think to your point that he was onto something there. America needed to revise its expectations there in the late 70s, and I think it may read even better now. That speech may have aged very well. So I think you convinced me very early in our relationship, all those decades ago, about that speech, and I've come to conclude that as well. But I appreciated Chris's comments about his post-presidency. He was here in Milwaukee in the late 80s doing a series of habitat houses when I lived in Milwaukee proper, and it wasn't too far from where we lived, so we went down a couple days and helped out. And I mean, he was working, he was working circular saws and, the implements of destruction. And it just, and he was no spring chicken then either. So it was interesting to see, here's a former president walking around on sheathing on a roof. It's just, it really is a great image that I'll always have, maybe what a post-presidency should be like. But I think Chris's point about his faith in forming his post-presidency is very well taken.
Well, and as Chris, you say, to some degree, it's called the malaise speech, but people, I think sometimes we forget the initial response was extremely positive. His approval rating went up 11 points in the 6 days following that. The seventh day, all right, partly with electioneering kind of media presence, things began to fall apart there, I guess, as far as it. But what I appreciated about it was twofold. One, he blamed himself for things. He said, he needed to go out and remember the speech was supposed to be an energy speech, specifically focused on the energy crisis that we were involved in, but he tore that up, and he literally, the first part of it, he's talking about people he went and talked to and quoted, the average Americans, and he took some responsibility for the problems, something that most presidents are fail to do. But I think the bulk of it is about virtue, that America was losing its sense of community, whether large community, a nation, or even local community there, and about sacrifice, and that our history was about sacrifice at various times, not just war. And I think he was one of the first presidents, if not the only president, to argue about sacrifice, during times when we weren't at war. The whole World War II sacrifice, everybody kind of understands, but asking the people to do that during a relative time of peace was very fascinating there. So, students, teachers, read that speech and see what you think about that, especially as we are in the 21st century and heading into a new administration. So let's
I'd
turn
like to hear
to
Mike,
our.
if Mike has any thoughts on it.
Mike was like 4 when the speech was read, wasn't he? Something like that. Good,
Yeah,
Mike,
sure.
thoughts?
I wasn't 4, but I wasn't voting age quite yet, Dave. Yeah, no, I don't remember him making that speech, but I do. Just echoing what everyone's already said. When I think of Carter, I think of like the model of what a citizen public official looks like, and acts like. So as much as the speech is important, just what he demonstrated after he left office in terms of not just his words, and all presidents set up libraries, many former presidents set up foundations. But he was out there actually, as I think Tim said, like walking the talk and doing the hard work. I remember USD has a School of Peace Studies. Just us and Notre Dame have a graduate school of peace studies. And our first director was the former director of the Carter Center. And so former President Carter actually came out for the inauguration. And I just remember thinking, how easily he sort of moved amongst the crowds of people who were talking to him, much as others have said, right? He just was super comfortable in his own skin, knew who he was. He was the person in that really rough period of after Watergate, after Vietnam. He's kind of the person. Him and Ford are the 2 leaders that we needed at that time to bridge us. So I think we're fortunate, and it's too bad that I think history will show like what an important person he was and what an important president he was. I think he actually did a lot of good things as president, even though it's kind of clouded by the world events that were happening around him.
Well said. Well said. I think in some ways his presidency is underestimated because of the 2 biggies, the hostage crisis and inflation. I got kind of overwhelmed, but there were tremendous contributions to world peace and domestic tranquility by President Carter. So let's go to our This Day in History segment, but I'm going to change it up just a little bit here, gentlemen. In this version, it will come in the form of a trivia question to see which of you, the friends here, is full of useless knowledge. All right, so on this day in 1935, the patent for the first board game to earn its creator $1 million was issued. What was that board game?
I'm thinking Monopoly.
That's what I'd go with.
Well done, Mr. Kavanaugh. Yes, it was Monopoly. The one game that I think after about age 15, I refused ever to play again because being the youngest in my family, I was always on the losing end and never got to choose the little dog as my piece to play there. I never got to be the banker kind of thing. So well done there, Professor Kavanaugh. So for this first episode, our second bonus episode of the 2024-25 academic year, we want to present a discussion on a somewhat provocative book that all four of us have read, entitled The Nation That Never Was, Reconstructing America's Story by Professor Kermit Roosevelt III. Thank you, Professor Kavanaugh, for the visual aid. In his work on America's founding, Professor Roosevelt presents the stories of two founding periods, the 1776-1787 story and the Reconstruction founding narrative. Each of these is broken down into three key elements. For the original story, which advocates present as a story of continuity from 1776 to 2024, you have the following three components: the Declaration of Independence as a statement of universal liberty and equality, the Revolution as a military stand and promotion of those ideals, and the Constitution as a codification of the Declaration. In the second founding, which Professor Roosevelt argues is both more relevant to the 21st century and the story that which should be told, is broken down as follows: the Gettysburg Address, Civil War as a demand for those values in the address, and Reconstruction as the constitutional codification of those ideas, principles. The key question that Professor Roosevelt presents is, why do we focus so much on the first narrative, which in his mind is exclusive to a minority of Americans, instead of the more inclusive second narrative? So let's begin our discussion with our forever skeptic, Professor Tim Moore. So Tim, we're going to start like we tend to do with maybe some, I don't know, definitions, some broad understanding of this concept of founding. So what do we mean when we use the term founding in historical and constitutional settings and discussions? And what constitutes a founding, in your opinion? Must a founding include philosophical, legal, and cultural components? So that's kind of a two-part question.
Yeah. I think actually that I'm glad you're asking this question before we launch into Roosevelt's book specifically, because I think this question, I think, can how you answer this question seems to me to be will heavily influence what you think of Roosevelt's book. I think his view of a founding, in my estimation, is pretty narrow. Maybe we can get into the narrowness of that later. But to your questions directly, Dave, which I mean, I'm really glad you asked this theoretical question before we get into Roosevelt. I guess for me, a founding could be a lot of things. It could be that you mentioned legal, philosophical, cultural. I think it can be all of those things. It can also be a moment where some sort of organizational structure is created. It can be a moment where there's fundamental speeches or documents that are relevant and widely read and believed. I think a founding also, you can't underestimate historical figures being associated with those moments. I think sometimes foundings occur when there's radical breaks from the past, or in regular parlance, a revolution maybe. I think there's also some element of ritualization that can take place for a founding, to identify a founding. Now, as a historian, I would say I always like a lot of wiggle room. So I'm going to say a founding can be combinations of all of that for a founding to occur. And so I'm defining founding pretty broadly in the American context, or actually in any context, because I think, to me, it's sleight of hand to make a founding as a narrow, to be defined narrowly. And I think Roosevelt defines it in how he interprets the Declaration pretty narrowly. But I think it can be a lot of things. So I really appreciate your menu of options there. And I've added a few more for people to think about what is a founding.
Chris or Mike, thoughts about that?
I think of the idea of taking the word and what is foundational or a foundation, and I think in terms of Tim the Toolman Taylor or Tim the Toolman Moore there, what is the foundation, and so I think it's what is our foundation as a nation, what is foundational. And I think all those things, and I think I really appreciate your question, David, and laying it out in terms of philosophical, legal, and cultural, these different components to take a look at, because I think all three of those provide foundations for us, and are foundational for the beginning of the nation. We just may not like looking back at how some of those things were played out. I think that's what Professor Roosevelt is going to get into.
Well, Mike, Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'll just add, I think it is a really good question. I mean, I tend to think that all societies, just like all students, if you just think about your own personal lives, I think there's multiple foundings that are kind of built upon themselves. So I guess if that's where, Tim, if that's where you're kind of going, where I don't quite see how Roosevelt has a narrow understanding, but I'm looking forward to hearing your argument. But I think that there are multiple foundings that kind of come together in any society's life and in any person's life. And so that can be cultural, it can be by an event that happens, it can be something legal or something institutional.
Well, I guess, Mike, this might be in your field of study here. I look at this comparatively, and I turn to my favorite country, and that's Canada. And I'm trying to think, okay, so when is Canada founded? Is it 1867? But they're not independent.
Right.
They're kind of quasi-independent in some realm, but foreign policy still run by England. Or is it 1934? How about, I mean, South Africa maybe, I guess, has a founding period similar to ours and has founding fathers and mothers similar to us. But what about England and France? Maybe Germany does. 1871, I guess, might be Germany's founding. Do you see where I'm coming at? I struggle with this as far as if we take an international or comparative perspective.
Yeah, no, I think I mean, this feeds into what I was just saying. I think Germany, you could say 1871, you could say 1945, right? You could kind of choose it. I mean, in United Kingdom, you could say, is it 1066 or is it 1688 or is it Magna Carta, right? So I think it's I think I'm not a historian. I think we look back and we're challenged to kind of like infer when is a moment when, because we're kind of alluding to founding as like when a people sees itself as sort of a self-governing community, like as a nation. If that's how we're talking about founding, that's so subjective, and it's so determined by whoever has the power to sort of start that narrative and to continue that narrative. So it's, to use one of Tim's words, it's squishy to me. I think that some Germans today might find 1933 as a founding, right? It kind of depends on your perspective, which makes it always contestable and always, to me, never solidified. This is something that is always kind of slightly in sort of soft sand. It's always slightly moving.
Well, but and again, I guess we'll get into it. I wonder, is that true for us? It seems that Professor Roosevelt is saying that we're stuck in a singular founding, all right, which is maybe the error of our ways, as a people there. Yeah, you were going to say.
Well, I don't want to jump too far ahead. I think his argument is that there's a dominant story about our founding that he is trying to challenge. I think what I read in his book is that he says there are multiple places where we can find a founding. It could be with articles. I'm just reading Reed's book, and Reed goes back to the 1760s. I mean, there are multiple places where we could say it starts. I think he is saying, trying to understand why is 1776 and the Revolution and the Constitution. Why is that considered the dominant founding narrative? Which I think has to do with power, and I think it has to do with who's ultimately sort of writing and archiving this information.
Well, let's turn to that, Chris.
I'm sorry, David, but I think also too, I mean, for the four of us and for some of the people that may watch this episode, our knowledge base is going to be a little bit better than the average American. And so if we're looking for that common narrative, which can unite a people as a culture, and I mean, we're going to get ready to celebrate the anniversary coming up in a couple of years. What is taught in schools, in terms of our beginnings. And, of course, everybody points to the Declaration in 1776 as the beginning. So I think it provides that common jumping off point for, I want to say, the average American who doesn't really go around, that don't carry their handy dandy pocket constitutions with them like the nerds that we are.
Yeah. So let's get into that, Chris. As I stated in the intro, Professor Roosevelt lays out the three components of the origin story: the Declaration, the military aspect, the Revolution, and then the Constitution. So kind of 1.5 questions here. I'm curious, and maybe I missed it, that he doesn't really reference the Articles, as a key component in that founding. But more importantly, do you see this founding where I think most Americans that you were just referencing would associate liberty and equality, those ideas in the second paragraph of the Declaration, as our founding principles? Do you think that is what this founding is truly about, liberty and equality, or is it more accurate to identify this period as a pursuit of unity? And if in that pursuit of unity, maybe we might sacrifice liberty and equality. What do you think about that?
Dealing with the second part of your question first, I think that's what Professor Roosevelt was going to argue about 1776 in the Declaration, is that we're going to sacrifice, equality. We're going to sacrifice liberty for unity. I mean, that is the point. And the idea is that most people, I think he is arguing that most people don't understand this Lockean statement in the Declaration, in the preamble of the Declaration, in terms of all men are created equal, and the idea that his argument is that what Jefferson is doing, he is simply stating that he's repudiating the divine right of kings theory, that because kind of we have to repudiate that, because if not, then we're a nation that are defying God by breaking away from the king. Because if King George III was ordained by God to rule us, then our rebellion is slapping to a God. So he's using that idea of equality to talk about the natural rights theory that everybody puts his pants on one leg at a time. So that's why we can justify our rebellion from a king that has broken the social contract. So, I mean, I think that's what Roosevelt's argument is. We don't understand it that way, though. We don't understand, because when we think about that sentence, perhaps the greatest sentence in the history of mankind, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We know that it's taken from Locke's second treatise on government. But we like to hold that up as the idea of our nation. But in 1776, that idea of equality was the idea that, well, kings are equal to people and people are equal to kings. And if we're insiders, then it's okay for us to be able to have this rebellion. Now, that doesn't apply to outsiders, which of course we're talking about enslaved people.
What about the Articles? Why do you think he skipped over the Articles?
Well, because I think, sorry, I had to jump in there. I appreciate the fact, David, that you did mention that he skips over the Articles. And I would make the argument that there is an equality principle. Well, I'll come clean. I think there's an equality narrative throughout all our history. But it just means different things at different times. Like, for example, equality in the Articles era is equality of states. Now, whether that's a good definition of equality or not, that's a normative discussion. So I think he does, to me, shockingly, he doesn't address the Articles at all. And I think there is an article principle under the Articles. Now, I think it was a political necessity that equality had to be defined as equality of states. And the individualization of equality comes later. But I think there is an equality principle that does bleed through all of our narrative that we have about ourselves. But I don't know why he misses that. I mean, my snarky answer is he's a political scientist and doesn't know there's such a thing called the Articles. Uh, I'll retract that.
I kind of like it. I like it.
No, I think, I mean, to restate it, I think equality, there is equality there. It's just being configured that states are equal rather than people. We're constantly trying to sort through the meaning of equality, and for a period of time, we may have gotten it wrong under the Articles, but it's there.
Okay. I think there's okay, no, that's good. I think there are two separate like arguments being made here. Okay, the first is that he does mention the Articles, but he doesn't have a whole like he doesn't build it out like the rest of it. And what he says about the Articles, which I think is really interesting, we can talk about this more. I mean, he seems to argue that the Declaration of the Constitution is a revolution of the status quo, is what he would call it. And he says one reason I can say that is because what do we do with all of the debts that the states incurred during the Articles? Well, we assume, I mean, that's one of the biggest policy fights we have at the beginning, right? Which he says is very different than what we do at the South after the Civil War.
Mike, we're having a problem with
we say we're not. I know.
Guys,
I'm slowing down.
Are you seeing that? Or is this just me?
No,
Yeah,
he's
Mike, glitchy.
Okay. I think it's because I move my hands too much, and then I'll be calm here. He does mention the Articles, and his argument is that the Articles, we assume the debts of the Articles, so he kind of sees the Constitution as this revolution of the status quo. So he mentions the Articles, but I don't think it has the same kind of founding moment that he's going to argue that the Reconstruction does. The second argument that I think Tim is making is about the notion of equality. And this is where we can talk about this more in a little bit. Like, I think he's basically saying, why are we doing this twister game thing where we're twisting ourselves to believe that our modern understanding of equality today is what was in the Declaration? Because he just says it's not there. Like you said, Tim, there was a different notion of equality. So he would say, fine, let's just break with that then. Because why are we kidding ourselves to say what Jefferson meant was all men are created equal is the same thing that we mean by equality and egalitarianism now? He would just say, we're trying to put our modern version back on the founders, which is, as we've discussed on this show so many times in our 140 plus episodes, is presentism at its worst. So he would say we can find that notion of modern equality better in the 1860s. So I don't fault him. I mean, he may be wrong with his history, Tim and Chris and Dave. Please, I think his critique of our understanding of the Declaration, I find it really powerful that we want the Declaration to do more work than it actually Jefferson meant it to do at the moment.
I don't necessarily criticize his history. And in fact, I find him in many ways, and maybe this was intentional, presenting, the common man's understanding is that there's a direct link between the Declaration and the Constitution, foregoing what goes on in between there. Because my understanding, or at least the way I presented, is that the Constitution of 1787 is more of a second founding. In many ways, shorter, but there's some similar principles, but it's a reaction to the failure of the first Constitution. Now, I don't know if Constitution creation equals founding, as we talked about in the first question there, and Tim's pointing there. So maybe I said something good there, Professor Moore.
Well, I think they can be separate. A founding of a people is different than the creation of their legal system, which is a part of I guess my main beef with Roosevelt is what he makes the Declaration into. He spends a lot of time making the Declaration into a constitutional document, and then he evaluates it and judges it pretty harshly based upon subsequent legal precedents. Now, I think that's in my estimation, that's a little sleight of hand to use court interpretation and legal interpretation subsequent to the Declaration and turn the Declaration then into a legal document. I think that's confining the Declaration in much too constrained terms. So I can appreciate his emphasis on equality being morphed and changed, and we're wrestling with the meanings of that. But my objection is to what he does to the Declaration, and then turns around and evaluates the Declaration by legal precedent. And I don't know that, I'm fairly confident in saying that I don't think Jefferson or anybody who had a hand in that would have accepted that document being perceived and evaluated by legal precedent subsequent to the writing of it.
Well,
right.
I think he was evaluating the document as it could, again, if we were thinking this is part of our national narrative, which I believe it is, I think he's evaluating it based on our practices. And, when he refers, he talks about Jefferson enslaving his own children. I think that's a pretty harsh practice to deal with from the guy that wrote "All Men Are Created Equal." So, again, that's why I go back to the argument that when he's talking about equality in that document, he's not talking about the equality we like to think of today. He is channeling the naturalized philosophy to justify rebellion, to justify revolution against the divine right of kings. But I think that Roosevelt's argument also takes a look at the practices that we engaged in and how they line up next to the ideas that that people understand today. So that's part of again, we're jumping from 1776 to today, and using that presentism and trying to explain that this is not a really, if you look at what was going on in 1776 all the way up through 1863, we weren't living up to these ideals. So that's why perhaps a different founding period to tell a better narrative is, I think, part of his argument.
I'm wondering if Tim, if to some degree he's channeling the general understanding of the American populace of this document. That is, I think you'd agree that a lot of Americans do think that the Declaration has legal standing. I gotta believe that in your teaching, you had to sometimes want to pull your hair out as you're trying to get the kids to understand the distinction between the Declaration, all right, as a political statement versus a legal document and the Constitution.
Well, it partially is. I mean, I'm not denying that it's not. I mean, look at the grievances. That's a great Constitution in reverse. I mean, so I'm not denying that there's constitutional content in the Declaration. But to Chris's point, there's a whole lot more philosophically going on, and I also would say culturally going on in addition to. And so that's, I mean, I guess I'm okay with if Roosevelt wants to beat up the Constitution and us not living up to those ideals, I'm more comfortable with that than I am what he created the Declaration into, and then sicked his legal analysis on the Declaration. So I just I think well, I don't want to jump ahead of myself because I know you probably got some questions that we can get into this, but yeah, you're right. I mean, that's always the great dilemma is the Declaration. I mean, even Lincoln hints at it occasionally. The Declaration was a constitutional document. So yeah.
I mean, Tim, are you referring, I'm sorry, Dave, if we're going down this rabbit hole, but he makes an argument. He's making the argument that the Declaration has become a part of our story and it shouldn't be. because it doesn't have the values that we think it has. I mean, I guess that's his argument, right? And then when you talk about the legal analysis, he talks about the way it was used in Dred Scott, right? And are you? I don't see him doing I don't see him doing the legal analysis as much as he's saying, look, the Lochner courts, Dred Scott, like a lot of these cases that we look at now and we say, ooh, that was a bad decision. The justices, they used the Declaration.
Mm-hmm.
So or do you think he's misinterpreting what the justices were doing, or is that not like, should you be more upset with the justices than you are with him? Like who's doing the legal analysis that you're upset with?
Well, that's a part of my problem with this is doing legal analysis on the Declaration and confining the meaning of the Declaration to the legal analysis.
Okay.
I just think that's too narrow. Does that make sense?
It does. I mean, to me, that was it was an add-on data point. I mean, to me, and again, he could be wrong with this because you know this stuff way better than I do. But his argument just about what the Declaration actually was as a document, right? That it was a treasonous document that said we don't want to be with the king and we have to justify it. His argument about what Jefferson had in it about slavery and then it had to get taken out because Southern states said we're not going to, like all the stuff we've discussed on this, what all men created equal means versus what the Declaration of the Rights of Man in France, when they say all men are born, this idea of created versus born, natural rights versus, I mean, to me, that's the compelling argument of like, oh my goodness, I've been taught that the Declaration is this document that, I don't know, has a relevance in 2024. And he seems to argue it just doesn't, that it had a particular relevance in 1776, but we shouldn't try to make it work 240 years later. I don't know. Do you?
Yeah. So Professor Williams, let's.
All right. Sorry.
No. Don't bother. This is good. This is good. But obviously the core of the book is making some kind of either connection or distinction between these two periods. And one of the more provocative and thought-provoking points that he made was that he argues that if one accepts the first narrative, all right, the original traditional narrative, then he argued then you must find the Emancipation Proclamation unconstitutional and the 14th Amendment illegitimate due to the extra constitutional nature of its ratification. This, I think you would agree, undermines the pretense of continuity in the American narrative, which that's the traditional narrative, is we can go from the Declaration to 2024, all right, and here are these founding principles, and it flows through. Yeah, there's some bumps in the road, but he makes the argument that if you use that original narrative, we don't get to the Emancipation and the 14th Amendment. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think he's right. I mean, I'm comfortable with that because I'm sorry, Tim. I'm really I don't have a lot of stock into this continuous argument. I mean, I just don't. I think we can say that as a people we have a history together, but that our history also has these moments of ruptures, as he puts it. All societies have these. I mean, the South African Constitution in 1996 doesn't ignore apartheid, but it also doesn't say, well, our values are the apartheid values. Just as the 1945 Basic Law in Germany acknowledges what happened during dictatorship and Nazism, it doesn't say that those are the values of the German nation. So I mean, his argument there is that Emancipation Proclamation, is invalid because of the Fifth Amendment, right? You can't take people's stuff. And that the 14th Amendment was passed without any Southern states consenting in the Jeffersonian sense to it. And I would say, yeah, you're right. Just like the Declaration of Independence was a document of treason, that if the revolution didn't turn out the way it did, all the people who signed it would have been put to death. What the founders in 1868 did, it was treasonous as well. They just blatantly ignored what the Constitution said, just as the founding fathers did with what the articles said. I mean, he's just making this argument that there's been these ruptures, and that I don't see why we have to argue ourselves around that. We can say that we have a history together and that part of our history are these ruptures. I mean, France has five constitutions since 1789. It's
Yeah, but we're
it's what,
different, Mike. I mean, and that's the whole premise, is that our very identity is based upon this possibly overly romantic notion of 1776 and the Declaration
yeah.
there. And so that's why I think it's important, bumps in the road, whatever you want to call it, is that I don't think we have a unified narrative as a people. I don't think we have a unified understanding of history as a people. I think that's been the problem of trying to forge a nation out of 13 states and now 50 states, is that we have a diversity of narratives. All right. At the center of that is the 1776 one. So
I think your point, David, it's a great point that I think a lot of this is colored by our commitment to exceptionalism. I think when you combine this idea of the American people being an exceptional people, our governance being exceptional, when you combine that with the desire, and therefore the narrative has to be singular and constant, I think the exceptionalism complicates that. And I have great suspicions about the notions of American exceptionalism at a philosophical as well as a religious rationale for it as well. But I think your point is well taken, that exceptionalism really does get in the way of discussing this narrative as possibly being discontinuity rather than continuity.
Sorry. Again, I can't stop it. It's a silver alert, but I'm right here, so I'm not missing.
A what?
The silver alert.
what's a silver alert? Is that a North Dakota thing?
That means an old guy wandered out of his house and it's snowing and he might freeze.
Mike, that's a world many universes
You
away
guys don't have silver alerts?
You got silver alerts, don't
We
you?
have silver alerts.
Are
No,
you joking
never
right
heard of
now?
them.
I don't know. I didn't know what you're talking about, but now I
No.
know.
No, neither one of
Well,
us.
let me get. I want to jump in here about the 14th Amendment, and I think Roosevelt makes a different argument about the 14th Amendment. His argument is about the 13th Amendment is not legit, because that's when the Southern states had to ratify the 13th. But in that 3-year time period, you're going to get former enslaved people into representation. Former enslaved people will be able to help. They'll be at state legislatures at that time to actually be able to vote on the 14th. And I think he makes the argument that the 14th Amendment is certainly more legitimate and more reflective of a broader base of people than the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment.
Well, I had a whole different reading. Is that, and my understanding just of the history is that under radical Reconstruction, ratification of the 14th Amendment was required to be admitted back into the Union. And I thought that's what he was referring to, is that they had a gun to their head. In fact, looking, preparing for this segment here, there are still people out there. One of them is on the Supreme Court that questions the legitimacy of the 14th Amendment because of the radical Reconstruction plan.
Well, the bayonet rule certainly during Reconstruction was a thing for sure. But I think he argues, and I've listened to him talk about this, is that the 14th Amendment is actually more reflective because during that small window of time there between 65 to 68, 1865 to 1868, and those ratifications of these amendments, you're going to end up with newly freed people, American men by this time, American men by this time, serving in state legislatures that will ratify the 14th Amendment. So that as they're voting on that, they, it's more reflective of the people. I think that's his argument.
Okay. All right. So, Chris, let's get to another of his, I think. Well, I guess this is where he lost me a little bit, in the sense that he says that we never really, at least as the modern understanding of 1776. And you quoted the poetic romantic phrase, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," that we never followed through on that never became a truism in the first 100 or so years of our history. And so, his argument is that he makes against the Declaration is that the values and principles laid out in the document do not translate into a legal foundation of our founding. Couldn't you say that is true of the 14th Amendment as well? That it doesn't translate. Yeah, we have a brief window, all right, but by at least 1883, if not 1896, with Plessy, the 14th Amendment is pretty much eviscerated as any kind of legal foundation. So I have a little bit of a problem. It seems that the history of the two periods is very similar. We have, this birth of an idea, but fairly quickly the resistance to that idea pretty much undermines the very romantic notion of these ideas, and they don't live until much later on. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm probably going to disagree with you on that. I think because if you look at the 1776 idea and the Declaration's idea, of course they didn't believe in equality for people, right? They didn't. I mean, they just look at what they practiced. They enslaved people, right? Of course they didn't believe in equality for people, right? Look at women. They didn't. So the idea that's this idea of, well, we're all going to be equal. Well, we just know that that's not true in 1776. We know that's not true until we get to the Civil War. And actually, I think when you start to think about the abolitionist movement in the 1820s, they're going to glom onto that idea of equality in the Declaration. And I think if you look at Alexander Stephens' cornerstone speech, Vice President of the Confederacy, he rips on Jefferson a little bit in his speech about equality, even though that's not the equality Jefferson was referring to in 1776. So we're moving towards this, and again, you get the Gettysburg Address, which actually is going to channel some of that Declaration of Independence. I mean, that's what Lincoln does. He goes to 76. He doesn't go to 1776, 1787. Sorry, folks. He goes to 1776 about this birth of freedom, the whole idea of a birth, a death, and a rebirth. And then, yes, we end up with the 14th Amendment. And there is a time period where we are moving towards these ideals during Reconstruction. And it was the 1877 compromise or deal that was worked out to allow Hayes the presidency and for home rule to be reinstated in the South, and the Redeemers win. The idea that these folks want to redeem the Southern government from these ideals of equality to put white rule back in place, and in many places done through violence, through these paramilitary groups and through violence of democratically elected folks in the southern states. So there was a window of time that the 14th Amendment followed with the 15th Amendment provided an opportunity to actually encapsulate these ideals, but those ideals fade away because we want unity again over justice. We want unity again over equality. So this deal was able to be struck, and then there's the failure of Reconstruction, in which we don't see again until perhaps the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, 64 and 65.
So do you really, I'm curious, Chris, do you believe that most Americans in 1872 believed in the equality of all men?
No, goodness no.
Well, how's that any different from 1780 or 1780 or 1790?
But that's what I think. I think Roosevelt. It was discouraging to me that because there were people. I think about all the Jacksonian era reform movements. A lot of those reform movements were very committed to the Declaration meaning something real. I mean, most notably the abolitionists, although you could still be a racist and an abolitionist. But many of those reform movements rooted their efforts in this notion of Declaration principles. Dorothea Dix, the feminist convention there at Seneca Falls. So I think Roosevelt kind of dismisses people before the Civil War that took the Declaration seriously. And he camps out on the legal things that undermine this notion of equality in the Declaration. And I think there's equally amount. I mean, there's all kinds of bodies on the side of the road after the 14th Amendment, people not believing that stuff to be true too. So I think your point to me is well taken, that there's all kinds of people in the civil rights movement from post 14th Amendment that are believing the 14th Amendment to be true and are doing a very important, crucial work, just the way there were people pre-Civil War that believed the original Declaration to be true and meaningful as well. So I think he's a little sleight of hand there in seemingly a little more favorable to post-14th Amendment efforts than he is Jacksonian era efforts.
Well, I disagree, Tim. I think he actually does. He talks about the abolitionist movement using the Declaration of Independence. He writes about that. He talks about that. So, I mean, the idea of actually, again, taking these ideas of equality and actually pushing for the, again, but you're right, though, it doesn't mean, I think of Frederick Douglass and what he said about Lincoln. He's a friend of, he's an enemy. He's a friend of the slave, not necessarily a friend to the Negro. I think that's what Frederick Douglass had said somewhat about Lincoln. But back, Dave, I forget the question that you asked me about the 14th Amendment and.
Well, I think Tim just to me, and this is where I have troubles with his writing, is that to me he overly emphasizes and romanticizes the 14th Amendment as laying the foundation for who we are today. Because to me, the story, the narrative of the 14th and the narrative of the Declaration are very similar. All right. Now, Mike has been sitting here for 5 minutes about ready to go. I think he's almost apoplectic. I used it right there. Professor Williams, before I go any further, I need to let you express yourself.
Well, I think, I mean, he mentions on page 203, he says, the new America is also flawed. In the very same sentence that penalizes states for racial discrimination in voting, the 14th Amendment licenses sex discrimination. So, I mean, he picks up on what you're saying, but I think those two failures are apples and oranges. He's
and that quote, and I had a problem with it because he's glossing over the implicit to say, well, we had problems post 14th, but then he turns to sex discrimination. But wait, we didn't alleviate the racial discrimination through the 14th either.
I think this is his argument. I mean, I think the Declaration of Independence, there's no way that we can look back on that and say, yeah, that was a document that the slaves could have been freed under. That's what Jefferson meant. He's like, we're just joking with ourselves. That's not what it meant. And the Constitution has at least 3 provisions that protect slavery, right? It's there. Now, while there were failures after Reconstruction with redemption, political failures, social failures, he would say we finally get it right. We have the values for the first time, not just the 14th, 13th, and 15th, the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln's other statements, what Bingham and others are saying. Yeah, you're right, David. If we took a poll back then, Gallup would not find that a majority of Americans believe in equality, for sure. But if we're going to pick a time period, if we're going to pick heroes, if we're going to pick something in the document that we can now frame social justice and social change movements around, why are we, again, doing these twists and turns to make it the Declaration when we have it in front of us with Lincoln? We started the Civil War and Lincoln said, unity at any cost. If I could free all the slaves and get unity, I'd do it. If I could free them, I would do it. By the Emancipation Proclamation, the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln has turned the war into a notion of equality and democracy. And Roosevelt says we should all laugh at Lincoln's interpretation of the Declaration. Because Lincoln does exactly what Americans before him have done. They're trying to turn the Declaration into something, but then he would say Lincoln's twist on it, America for the people, by the people, of the people, is a democratic, egalitarian statement of which has never been said before. And the 14th, 15th, and 13th Amendments are saying things that had never been put in print before. We, as 24, 25 Americans, we should be going back to those documents if we're fighting for justice, instead of trying to go back to 1776. I think that to me is the power of his argument. It's just like, if you're gonna, where do you want the story to actually
You're breaking up.
have its roots in period, even though it failed? Yeah.
Chris?
Well, I'm probably just going to say the same thing Mike just said, but the Declaration of 1776 it provides no legal framework for equality. It provides no legal framework for pursuing equal justice under the law. The 14th Amendment provides a legal framework for pursuing that equal justice under the law. Do we achieve it? Oh, hell no. Does having a law change make people not racist? My goodness, no. Right? So the idea, but the 14th Amendment provides that legal framework for us to move forward. And I do think that this is one thing where I do take him to task, because I would argue that the Declaration also provides inspiration, an aspirational document for us to try to work toward, judging from 2024, my 2024 glasses on, where he doesn't think that's something that maybe we should do, but he's willing to do that very same thing with the 14th Amendment when it comes to women's rights. He's willing to say, okay, yeah, we didn't achieve it with equality for women through the 14th Amendment right away, but it provides the impetus for it. Well, I would argue that the Declaration also provides the impetus for us to move forward to the 14th Amendment. So that's where I would quibble with him a little bit on that.
I'd say I'd take it a little bit past aspirational, though, Chris, and I'm glad you raised that point, that it's an aspirational document, more so than a legal document. But at the state level, there are real things occurring legally that this aspirational document that you've mentioned. States are abolishing slavery now gradually, and that's a different kind of discussion, whether gradualism or immediatism, and that was a tremendous fight amongst the abolitionist movement. But there are states that took a philosophical part of that document seriously and did legal things at the state level. And I was a little disappointed that, and I know it doesn't bolster his argument to mention that there are legal things that are running counter to his thesis about the Declaration. But I guess I'd just like to point out that there are some states that were doing legal things with the implications of this notion of equality that I wish he would have mentioned a little bit more.
Well, we've talked about it, but I think we need to get to maybe what is at the core here. And in preparation for our discussion, I found a number of reviews of Roosevelt's book, and I focused on the critical ones. And many of the critics argue that, like the 1619 Project, Roosevelt overemphasizes the role of race and class in American history rather than looking at the revolutionary ideas of liberty and equality that were birthed in the 1776 to 87 period and flowered in the late 19th and early 20th century. Tim, I'm curious, what do you think about that? Do you think that one of the problems that Roosevelt has is putting race at the center of the American narrative?
No. Well, maybe.
Okay, you had me there for a minute.
Yeah, I'm sorry, David. I gave you false hope. Chris and I have been arguing about the Project 1619 now for, I don't know, how long has it been out, Chris? 6-7 years now?
Yeah, a little longer now, I think.
And I guess I've come to this conclusion, and it might surprise Chris to some degree. I think I wouldn't have been, I would be okay with the 1619 Project if one word was changed. I think there's a difference between putting race as protecting slavery as the reason for the American Revolution, as opposed to a reason for the revolution. I think the way I read the 1619 Project is it basically, and correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, because I've read sizable portions of the stuff. But the argument seems to be protecting slavery was the reason we had the revolution. Well, was slavery a reason that some people jumped on to the revolutionary cause? Yes. But there are many people that jump onto that revolutionary cause for other reasons as well. So if one word was changed from the reason to a reason, I think I'd be a little more generous towards the Project 1619 than I was an original. originally when it came out. So I do think there's an overemphasis there. Like, I think there's an overemphasis in putting all your eggs in one basket, so to speak, as the 1619 project has done.
No, I
Go
would
ahead,
agree
Chris.
with that assessment, though, Tim. The idea, obviously, we've talked about the Somerset case before, which I know the 1619 project definitely addresses as one of the reasons for rebellion. And I do like your assessment. It's definitely a reason. It's not necessarily the reason. I also would say to look at the Treaty of Paris and what did the people want? They wanted their property back, which the Brits, and that included enslaved people that were freed by the British, given uniforms, and encouraged them to run away. And so part of the Treaty of Paris was wanting to get that property back, which was those people were not returned, which the British never did. And also, and I just was reading something earlier today, which made me wonder about look at what happens in Haiti in the 1790s, and it finishes up in 1804 with the revolution in Haiti. You had 500,000 enslaved Africans in Haiti, the most profitable piece of land at that time in the world in terms of sugar and coffee production. And France is getting half of its income from that one small island. And then Toussaint Louverture leads a successful slave rebellion, and and what they're doing is they're living the Declaration of Independence. The average life expectancy for an enslaved person in Haiti was like 5 to 7 years because it was so bad. And so they're living the very ideals at that time period of the Declaration of Independence of being equal. And yet, where were we in our support of that? We were totally opposed to it, because if that can happen in Haiti, it can happen in the Dominican Republic, and it can happen in South Carolina, it can happen in Georgia. And so I think that's an interesting thought that, if we were really thinking about these ideals in the Declaration, we would have been right there with the Haitians and helping them out, but we were not.
I I would just add, I think, I'm not a historian. I think any historical analysis that says there is the cause is bad history. I've read through the 1619 book volume, the edited version. I find it to be the chapters to be very nuanced and to talk about race as a factor that has been overlooked in a lot of history. And maybe there is a chapter that says it was the factor. If it did, then I'm on board, Tim. I would just wonder, and I don't know this, the Dunning School is a shadow over all this. And the vitriol that 1619 has taken has the same vitriol come to the Dunning School. Like this idea that the reason for the Civil War was, states' rights and not slavery. And it was because of Black Americans' bad actions that Reconstruction failed. I don't know. I don't think there's been the same pushback against that. That school, there are portions of the public who may not know that school, but who would subscribe to that narrative.
Sure.
And I think what 1619 is trying to do is it's trying to provide a counter to a very dominant story that has been just told over and over again. So I'm not a historian.
Yeah. Well, I think Gordon Wood and Sean Willents didn't help matters much. It's some of the old guard that really got worked up about 1619. I don't know that they helped the cause. And I think Sean is backed off a little bit on some of his original vitriol that he meted out upon the project. And there's been so much great work done on the role of slavery and race at the founding. And so, I mean, to deny and their grand sweeping critique, I think, has undermined some of the really great work that's been done by historians. I mean, Gordon is up there in age, and so Sean is as well. So it is interesting to me that a younger group of revisionist historians have done some really great revisionist history. And their the original backlash, I don't think helped people to see some nuance that should have been seen.
Yeah, true. So, Mike, let's get to the $60,000 question here. Does it really matter which narrative model we adopt, the standard or the post-Civil War model to understand who we are here in the 21st century? Can it be both, or can it be neither?
Man, you're asking like with my academic hat on whether it matters. Heck yeah, it matters, I would say.
Wait a minute, that's your academic hat?
Yeah, I know. It's the Posey era. So I got my Giants hat on, my academic Giants hat on. No, I do think it matters. And I was reflecting on this. I was thinking, you said this is our 141st episode, David. That's kind of amazing. It's great times.
We keep losing you, Mike.
The bookends of a lot of our conversations have been about, am I back now? Am I back now?
It's
Take your
sketchy.
video off. Maybe that'll help.
You're frozen.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Please give me a heads up if you miss the audio. I'll try to talk a little more slowly. I think I'm talking too fast. I think it does matter. I think a lot of the meta conversations we've had on this program has been about the bookends of the challenge of America is who the we are, like how inclusive are we? How do we define our nation? And the back end has been, why can't government work better? Why can't we change some of the things that from 1789 that we know in 2024 just don't work right? And I think those two things are directly connected to Roosevelt's arguments. I think the narrative that we tell ourselves, if we were to tell a narrative that America's history is one of constant change and innovation and rupture, and we don't have to bow down to the founding fathers and treat them as sacred, I think it might be a little easier to pass some amendments to change the way we are doing things. I also think that Roosevelt's arguments about what the Reconstruction period offers us, I agree with him. I think it's a much more inclusive idea of who we are as a nation, even though we haven't lived up to it. Um, and many civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King at the end of his life, kind of looked back at the I Have a Dream speech and said that was a little too optimistic. That was a little too much of the dominant standard story. And you know what? I'm going to go back to the essay I wrote in high school about Reconstruction. Reconstruction was divisive. It was hard. It was military force, but we were doing it for the values that really make us who we are. So yeah, I do think it matters, but I think it's something that's I'm not going to see in my lifetime. I'm glad to be part of a process of sort of trying to change the narrative, but these things take a lot of time. And the final thing I'll say on this, I did a quick chat GPT search asking both with the Obama speeches and Trump speeches, how much the Declaration of Independence and Revolution were mentioned versus Reconstruction. And Obama was predominantly Declaration and Revolution, but there was some major speeches where he talked about Reconstruction and equality. With Trump's speeches, the only time, according to the robot, that it's the birther movement. It's the idea that maybe there isn't birthright citizenship for certain outsiders. So, and I think these narratives take up a political space. They inform political strategy. So I do think it's really important, even though for most Americans it's going to seem abstract and it's not going to be something they're going to be thinking about. But I do think it's important for folks like us to be talking about these other ideas because I think they have real political outcomes.
Well, I think that's well said, Mike. I think that's well said. So we have come to the end of our time together, our allotted time to discuss this wonderful work by Professor Roosevelt here. So as is our tradition, let's have some final thoughts from our scholars, some insights that teachers and students might want to consider. Professor Moore?
Yeah, this first of all, this was I got dragged kicking and screaming into reading this book. Actually, maybe shamed, or maybe even bullied by my dear friends. And I'm glad they did. This was a fantastic book, very thought-provoking. it really forced me to think through some things. It clarified a few things for me. I mean, I disagree with major portions of the book, but it's a fantastic book. And We the People teachers, I think We the People teachers should really read this book. And I would recommend, I don't buy the argument hook, line, and sinker, but it is worth thinking about. Is there a second founding? That's a great question that I think should show up in We the People classrooms. And this book, I think, does a great service to do that. The other thought I had was, and maybe it's my temperament, there's probably a lot going on in my attitude towards failure. I guess I'm willing to hold to the belief that even in hypocrisy, I can live with large degrees of failure and hypocrisy. Like if the Declaration, we've not lived up to those things. Now, Roosevelt says those ideals weren't even there. But I'm willing to say the ideals are there and live with failure and hypocrisy. Whereas I think he's a little more unwilling to do that. Now, I would also ask him, how much failure and hypocrisy do we have to live with before we evaluate the 14th Amendment as rigorously as you've evaluated the Declaration? So I think the danger of the book is having the failure, at least on the first founding, overwhelmingly lead you to a position of cynicism and rejection about that first founding. I'm willing to say that failure and hypocrisy does not undermine principle. And I know that's a tough sell, I think, in the era we live now, because I think there's tremendous amounts of perfectionism that we expect culturally, as well as with our friendships and our relationships. We expect perfectionism. I'm not willing to buy that product.
Professor Kavanaugh.
Yeah, listening to Tim, I would agree that this would be a good summer assignment to assign for your kids coming into your class, and maybe giving them a short, thin volume to read that is thought-provoking over the summer, to come into the next year's We the People class with some ideas about it. Professor Roosevelt calls himself a revisionist. So, I mean, certainly, we're talking about that earlier in the discussion. I liken it to, and partly I'm glad we mentioned American exceptionalism, because I think that with that concept, I know that we've talked on many of our shows about that idea, that gets in the way of our maybe having a truer understanding of ourselves. But I liken it in a way, to the Magna Carta of 1215, because the Magna Carta of 1215 does not give rights to Englishmen. It establishes some control the nobles have over the king, but it's the beginning. It's planting a seed, right? And that seed takes a long time to come to fruition. Much like the Declaration, the principles of the guy that wrote it, Jefferson, they would not be principles that we would emulate today, because he believed it was okay to enslave your children because of their skin color, and he grew up in that society where that was accepted, and that was the practice of the day, right? Let's face it, Sally Hemings' half sister was Jefferson's wife. I mean, because they shared the same father. That was the practice of the day. So those are principles that maybe we should not emulate. But the Declaration's idea does plant a seed. And we talked about the fits and starts as a nation that we've gone through. My goodness, a civil war, 2% of the population is killed to try and allow this seed to really take hold and to grow. And, the 14th Amendment does provide that legal framework for it to move forward. It's not perfect. We still struggle today. We still struggle mightily today because of different narratives and different stories. So I'm not really ready to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That is the Declaration. but I do believe that it's important. The idea of Reconstruction in that time period is a great place for us to really to think about hanging our hat on what we were trying to achieve through the Civil War, through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and I'll throw the 19th Amendment in there as well, in terms of for female or suffrage. Excuse me, but I think it's important for us to be able to take a look at this time period and understand that, even today in 2024, we still have so many issues that we're not living up to these ideals. And I always like to think of and Professor Roosevelt talks about outsiders and insiders. And I've always talked with my history classes, the history of the United States is one of expanding the us, reducing the other. And in 1776, the Declaration of Independence didn't really expand the us at all. But I think if we think about it, the history of it that way, that idea of equality helps us expand the us and try to reduce the other.
Professor Williams.
I'm not turning off my video just so I don't.
Well, can I have one other thought, Mike, before you go? I think that all of us should get pictures of ourselves from like 25 years ago that we can put up.
You can't see the gesture I'm making at you right now, Chris. Okay, I have two small things, and then my main point, I guess. I would say students watching. Oh, okay, teachers watching this. To what Tim and Chris said, I think this is a definite must read. It's really, really good. I agree with Tim. You don't have to buy the whole argument, but it's really well argued. The bibliography at the end, he has a bibliography based on different periods in American history, and it's just like all the best books are there. So I would take a look at that as well. To the students out there, I think what we kind of need, if you're on board with making this narrative kind of be your project for the next 70 years, we need a Lincoln or a Bingham musical. We need something to popularize to really kind of get these ideas out there in pop culture. There's also a host of documents that University of Wisconsin, Tim Moore right now is sitting on. And it's kind of telling that there's all these documents from Reconstruction that right now have not found a home to have the kind of serious research being done that what Tim has been working on for the last decade or two with the founding documents. I think that's telling that we need that work. We need to archive this, and we need to have the volumes that Tim has been putting out with the Declaration, Bill of Rights, and the founding period. We need that with the Reconstruction stuff. And then I would just argue, like, I didn't have a chance to say, I mean, my one the one assumption that Roosevelt makes that I would just have everyone just like question, he kind of just assumes that our modern values today is this notion of sort of individual freedom and equality. And he just kind of assumes that's the ideal to which America is all about. And where do we find those ideals? And then he launches into his argument. And Dave brought this up a little bit ago, just like with what Americans think. I don't know if we should, I don't know if that's an assumption that we should just take. Maybe we are a society that values unity over equality. Maybe we are a society where division is, to get rewarded in politics, it takes more division than it takes bringing people. I don't know. I just found myself, he kind of didn't have any evidence to show that we really are a nation where equality is our main value. Maybe it's not. And if you're going to read this book, I would just keep that in mind and be thinking in your studies about what evidence do you have in your communities about what are the values that Americans living by. I mean, Tim has brought up numerous times on these 141 episodes that maybe the value that really drives what makes us American has something to do with commercialism, capitalism. And so maybe Roosevelt is spinning an argument that is kind of based on his own idea of what America should be. And maybe that's just not who we are as a people. I don't know. I think it's an empirical question that you should all be asking.
Well, Mike, you made me think, in this balance of unity and equality, I'm of the belief right now in at the end of 2024, beginning of 2025, that we don't value either unity or equality as the election to me expressed. But to students and teachers, to students especially I would say if I were a judge, I would hope to hear more about the 14th and Reconstruction's impact on our values and principles. I think, Mike, what you said about, is looking at Obama and Trump and their speeches. I think that's true throughout every presidency. We overemphasize that founding and the Declaration, and we very seriously underemphasize the 14th Amendment's impact on our modern era there. I do believe, as we made the plan to do this discussion in reading the book, that every unit of study in the way that people text comes out in this
Yeah.
book. That is, I find relevance in every unit there, and so hopefully teachers, you can help students find that, or hopefully we've helped you a little bit, whether you're in Unit 1, Unit 4, Unit 6, or whatever. See some relevance in this work to what you're preparing for in April. So next week we will start our discussions on the We the People national questions. We'll be looking at Unit 1, Question 3, and the Constitution's attempt to limit the impact of ambition and avarice on our system of government there. And so we look forward to that discussion. Until then, peace, love, you ever tacos? Bye bye. Bye bye.